Hello and welcome to Inside Events, a new contemporary podcast focused on the key issues in events and festivals. This week, I'm joined by Daniela Heerdt Shubham Jain from the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, who've just recently written a book, co-edited a book with their colleague William Rook called The Routledge Handbook of Mega Sporting Events and Human Rights. So we just start off, thank you so much for joining us on Inside Events. We'll just start off with the first question, which is, who are you both and what is the Centre for Sport and Human Rights?
Yes, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having us. So I'm Daniela. I'm the Centre's Head of Education and Research since recently. I've been with the Centre since its inception. The Centre was launched in 2018. And it is basically the outcome of many years of work by organizations that are now represented in our advisory council. The Centre used to exist before as a multi-stakeholder platform, the mega sporting event platform for human rights, which then was hosted by the Institute for Human Rights and Business. But in 2018, we became an independent organization, and with the switch to becoming the Center for Sport and Human Rights, also the scope of the center's work expanded from mega sporting events to also include day-to-day sports and human rights issues linked to that. And what we do is basically we try to harness the power of sports and act collectively to fully align the world of sports with human rights. And we share knowledge, build capacity, increase accountability, and we do see ourselves basically as this critical friend and an impartial convener to bring together the different stakeholders in the world of sports and build this network of engaged organizations to embed human rights commitments in sports. Yeah, and that's the Centre, and I'm going to hand over to Shubham to introduce himself.
Thanks, Daniela, and thanks, Mike, so much for having us. I'm Shubham. I'm a policy and research fellow at the Centre, working on various education research initiatives. In my full-time role, I'm actually a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, working on an intersection of sports, governance, human rights, diversity with a particular focus on cricket. So the work with the Centre aligns very well with what I'm doing in my doctoral research as well.
That's great. Thanks both. Shubham, I don't know how you do it, straddling both worlds. Could you tell me a little bit about the book that's at the core of what we're talking about today? What is it? How did you put it together, I guess? And why is it important right now, if that's not absolutely obvious?
Right. Thanks so much, Mike. So obviously, I've been doing two things at the same time, inspired by Daniela. She did that, and I'm just following on her footsteps. More about the book, I think. So I came into this project about a couple of years ago when the book was sort of already starting to take shape. Routledge had actually reached out to us to sort of edit a book on this subject, and we were very happy to do that. The Centre had previously, in 2017, published 11 white papers on various aspects of sports and human rights, particularly in the mega sporting event context, when the Centre was still part of the IHRB, which Daniela mentioned earlier. And these papers were sort of rich in knowledge and experience and published by various stakeholders and people working in this space, and they needed an update. So that's where the idea sort of came together with what Routledge was proposing. And we put out an open call for the book chapters so that people from different disciplines and different parts of the globe could sort of submit proposals for chapters in the book. And that's where sort of I also came in as a research assistant. And I think it was sort of quite kind and generous for Daniela and William to put my name on the book. And I think that's something that I'm quite appreciative about, the fact that as a research assistant, I could come in and take such a huge role in the book and take more ownership of the project. And we organized this authors workshop sometime in the summer of 2022, which was quite appreciated by most of the authors, where some people submitted their drafts, and that gave us an opportunity to sort of comment on the drafts. That worked really well. We also made sure that there were several cross-references within the book, which really sort of connects the entire book together, and kept a close watch on the ongoing development so that more recent developments could also fit in, which you'll see from the later chapters of the book. I'll just hand over to Daniela to speak more substantially about the book content and something about the future.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Shubham. I think what makes this book so unique is really this combination of research and working and experience in practice that you can see throughout the different chapters. And we try to adopt the structure where in the beginning, of course, we talk about the normative framework, the principles, a bit also of the history, how human rights came into the mega sporting event context and field. But we also really try to link it to very concrete case studies, very concrete stakeholder groups, very concrete human rights. And the contributors are really coming from academia and research, but also from working in this field in practice. So we have several people that are actually sponsors or coming from sports bodies or representing athletes. So it's really a nice combination in that sense. And I think it is definitely unique. It's the first book written on this topic, the first book also that really takes this whole business and human rights field into the mega sporting event context. And it's been a really great privilege to work with Shubham on this. It wouldn't have happened without Shubham. So thanks in that regard. It was really welcome, everything you did. But I feel like it was also unique because we had the support of the center, we had all the center's friends contributing, and we had Mary Robinson launching the book together with us at the Sporting Chance Forum in December, saying lots of great things about it. So I think we did something good here, and we really hope to contribute to the body of knowledge, the body of literature that is now growing in the field of sport and human rights.
Completely, and thanks for that. And yeah, there's obviously a huge groundswell in terms of people researching, writing, educating. You see now more courses all over the world, modules, minors, majors at university programs. It's pretty amazing to see how in tandem policymakers, big criteria, pledges are kind of growing at the same time as we're all kind of chipping in from the kind of social commentary and side. So it's very interesting to see how that's kind of growing in tandem. I was just going to kind of quickly ask, how far do you think the research side is connecting appropriately with the stuff that's happening on the ground and the actual human rights issues? And do you think there's strong connections, or is there sometimes some disconnections between research that we need to address to just make sure that it's all as relevant as possible, really, in helping the cause?
Yeah, I can try to take this one first, and Shubham, please add if you feel like I've missed something. I think you always have better research if it shows some sort of element from practice, right? But not every researcher, let's say, gets that access to how things are really working in practice. And I feel like sports is a place where often you might struggle with that, especially if you're talking about maybe the bad side of sports. So there's really this difficulty, I think, here to get the information, the data that you need to come up with relevant research and research that is connected to how things really look in practice. I do think if I look at the things that are out there or the things that we know of, obviously I also don't know all of it, and I don't know, what great work is maybe done elsewhere in the world. But from the things that I see, I have the feeling that it's quite well connected to the actual problems in the real world, in the world of sports. And what you just described, Mike, is something that the center is looking at from this perspective of perhaps being that intermediary that can make sure that there is a clear connection between what is being researched and what is happening in practice. So in that sense, I'm very grateful that you asked this question, because at the center, we are trying to build a global research network, a global sport and human rights research network, because we feel like we are in a position to connect the research that's ongoing with actually the people that are trying to do better, that are trying to make the world of sports a better place, and to help researchers have real impact with what they are coming up with the data they're analyzing, the conclusions they're drawing, the findings they're coming up with. So, short answer is I feel like there's always a discrepancy in a certain way, but there are ways to make it better, and we at the center, we feel like we are in a position to try to help to bring these two closer together. Yeah.
That's great.
Maybe if I just add quickly to what Daniela said, I think, and the question also ties in well with the idea of why we need to have human rights sort of discussions in the sporting environment, right? And I think that's where the unique place of sports as a system, as an activity that we have in this world makes a lot of difference, because it's in the news all the time. Anything that happens on and off the field makes it to the news, especially with the social media sort of advent. It is really out there. And which is why I think any human rights element comes in really, really fast. And I've been seeing a lot of research happening recently, which is directly related to something that happened last week, for instance, on a sporting field or in the sporting context. And then sports bodies sort of adopting or adapting their policies. So something I can think of is online abuse, for instance, which is quite common in case of players don't perform well, etc. And so much of research is happening on this, and so many sports bodies are now sort of adapting to it, introducing really new sort of measures to tackle online abuse against players, for instance. And I think that way, sport shows us a path to sort of connect the practice and the theory in the real time. So there is a way to sort of study that as well and see how that can improve, not just in sports, but outside sports as well.
No, that's great. And yeah, it's definitely one of the beauties of being in a more kind of applied sport, event, tourism, leisure field, is that we tend to be much more closer to the social problem or the empirical phenomenon than, for example, more kind of broader disciplinary economics or history professors and that sort of thing. And I think there's a really unique opportunity to do more. I often see that like a lot of professors around the world, they see the kind of the impact stuff and the application stuff as an output or outcome of their research. But there needs to be a huge shift towards bringing all those key stakeholders in the design and implementation and methodology of the research first, so it's super relevant, that it's informed by real problems and everything, and then work with it. And then they've got those stakeholders obviously at the very end as well, don't they? And then obviously kind of the support that you're giving to academics as kind of connectors is really important in that. And obviously, Shubham, for your PhD, then that's obviously something that to consider. How do you bring everyone at the beginning instead of always just as the people that you disseminate to? And it just seems as though if we crack that better, then we'll have more relevant research. That's great. So next question. What are the top 3 challenges facing human rights and major events? We probably need several days on this one, but top 3.
Yeah, I will try to give this a go. I think this always depends very much on, well, always is also not true. It depends on where these events take place on the one hand, right? So we see there are certain human rights issues that are linked to mega sporting events, which are really structurally linked to them. So these are human rights issues that constantly would come up in the context of organizing these events. And there, I think the first thing that comes to mind is really workers' rights. And we all still remember what was going on in Qatar, so the construction workers. But it's actually much broader than that, right? So a lot of workers are needed for organizing, staging, delivering such an event. It's not just the construction sector, it's hospitality, it's people that are selling things at the event venues, much more. So there's really, I think, this whole topic around labor rights will continue to be, I think, one of the big issues when it comes to mega sporting events and human rights. The other thing, I think, that's now, if we look more into where the next couple of events are happening, it's also safety and security, things related to crowd management, safeguarding, responsible policing, but also in connection with what kind of security and safety measures are being used, to what extent can they infringe on privacy rights, for instance, but also things like, how is data managed and protected, all the data that's collected from fans, but also athletes, for instance. So I feel like safety and security is a big field that splits up into different kind of topics that are also very relevant, I think, in the next, this year and the next upcoming events. And you asked for three. I think the last one probably is how we engage local communities, residents in the host cities, in the host countries. And here you have, of course, different kinds of groups, different kinds of local stakeholders, and things that can come up might, for instance, relate to the homelessness in a certain city. So housing rights can be one issue, but you can also think about children's rights, how to engage children, how to make sure they have a say in the decisions that are being taken around redesigning the city to enable the hosting of such an event. I think if you look at mega sporting events and human rights, this might be the three top challenges, but someone else might give another answer. And it also looks different if you think about day-to-day sports, of course. There might also be other issues coming up.
Completely. And Shubham, do you want to give your top three, or are yours Daniela's?
I mean, I think we pretty much can talk about 30 instead of top three, but I think I'll just elaborate a bit on the last point that Daniela was making about day-to-day sports. And I think that is a very important point in the sense that we often end up talking about mega sporting events, the football World Cups, the Olympics, so on and so forth. And in that, what we end up missing is that most of the sports, most of the people who engage with sports directly participate in day-to-day sports, grassroots sports, local communities. And the issues there might vary significantly. And I think this is a very opportune time to sort of think about it. We are celebrating the 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights this year. And this is something that was mentioned by the founders of the document, is that human rights happen at the local level. It's not just the big picture things, but also the small picture things, right? So things about inclusion of local communities, who is able to participate in local sports, and through that, who is able to come to the top. That is a concern that is very relevant. Things about transgender inclusion, for instance, those are things that are much more relevant and important in local sports, and specifically in the US context, you would know what is happening in each state. So many laws being sort of thought about around that. So I think when we think about sort of challenges, we should think about from the mega sporting perspective, but also from the grassroots perspective. And as Daniela said, it depends on the geographies, the context, and the sport you're talking about. So to have a sort of multi-pronged approach is, I think, what is important.
That's really good. Thanks for those responses. And just kind of a follow-up. I'm always kind of intrigued to see how people frame human rights issues and violations, quite ardent things, the worst of the worst, with social injustices or unsustainable sorts of development. And you kind of constantly, people frame them in different ways. Some people would argue that certain social injustices or unsustainable development is a human rights violation. And some people might downplay the human rights violations and just say, oh, that's just unsavory. Kind of using more fluffy language, unsavory, oh, it's kind of unsustainable, or it's uninclusive, or, however they frame it. Do you at the center, or perhaps individually, do you have a kind of a line as to what is a human rights violation, and what is just less desirable, unsustainable, less inclusive practice that's more of a social injustice, but not of a human right violation? Hopefully that makes sense. But I do think it's important that we kind of have a spectrum, I guess, of that. Do you have a thought on that? Or
of course, I think about that all the time when I teach about human rights. Although I should start differently. There's not that much thinking to be done from my perspective, because for us, the line is the law. So by that, I mean, we have international human rights standards. And for most of these, it's quite clear when something is a human rights violation and when it is not. I can give one of my favorite examples is when you talk about housing rights, so local communities that are being displaced. As such, displacing people is not a human rights violation, right? Cities develop, cities change all the time. But what makes it a violation is if, for instance, they haven't been informed beforehand, if there hasn't been a chance for them to make their voice heard, and most importantly, if they haven't been compensated adequately. So if they didn't get alternative housing, if they didn't get enough money to find alternative housing, all these kinds of things. So I feel like from a legal perspective, it's quite clear when something is a human rights violation and when it's not. However, when I teach human rights, I like to say that there's human rights in theory and human rights in practice. And also, human rights don't mean the same for everyone. And then there's another layer that you can add on top of that when you are in the sports world. And that is, I think we are all aware at the center that the human rights language or the human rights label is not always the one that will bring you further in your contacts with the different stakeholders. And what I mean by that is sports bodies have a lot in place. They're doing a lot of good work from a human rights perspective, but they might not necessarily label it as human rights work. And I think that's something that we all need to really think about and that we all need to keep on top of our mind. Yes, we are the Center for Sport and Human Rights, but we also understand that, this human rights term can be sometimes a very loaded term. I guess that would be my answer to that question. Shubham, feel free to disagree or add or
No,
yeah.
Very difficult to follow up on that one, I think. So absolutely agree with whatever Daniela has said, especially from her experience as a teacher, her experience as a researcher. Maybe the only thing I'll add is that for me, thinking about human rights is, yes, thinking about the human rights law, the difference between the theory and the practice, but also thinking about human rights from the perspective of what it means, right? It means that if we are thinking about an issue, we think about it from a people-centered and a human-centered view, which is that instead of going into the question of whether it's a human rights violation or not, the question is that this is a potential issue. There's a human or there are humans involved which might be affected by the happening or the non-happening of this event. And then how do we think about that? How can we prevent violations from occurring? How can we ensure that there is remedy available in case violations happen? So it's more about thinking of any issue or any topic from the lens of the people who are potentially going to be affected. So that is probably the human rights element or thinking in that sense.
That's great. No, great responses. Obviously, I kind of feel the exact same. And when it comes to certain things that aren't necessarily human rights violation being pitted as a human right violation, sometimes that can actually be quite unhelpful for the exact reason that you said, Daniela, because it puts people's backs up. And although they might be right, but they're not effective. And it really is about splitting up. It's mainly about being effective and making that change, isn't it? So no point using that language. Using that language in Florida, for example, does not get you anywhere at all. So you have to slightly kind of tone it down, somewhat bowdlerize the term sometimes. Cool. Okay, so in terms of those issues that you just mentioned, those top ones, I guess, what's the centre doing specifically that might be helping to tackle those in real terms?
The handbook is a great example, I think, obviously. So I think we at the center have this strategy, and there are three sort of broad limbs to that. So it's about generating awareness, it's about building capacity, and creating lasting value. So those are the sort of three ways in which we look at our work. The handbook is a great example of sort of generating awareness, building capacity, creating lasting value, all three of them, which is great. Overall, I think center, we see ourselves as the convener, in the sense that we convene people and get people together and stakeholders together in the room. So we work on getting a coalition of actors, the sport governing bodies, the federations, the sponsors, broadcasters, labor unions, governments, NGOs, everyone together to sort of discuss the most pressing issues and find solutions that are amenable to everyone. We recently had the Sporting Chance Forum in December, which is a great example of this convening role. We had so many commitments being made there. So that's the sort of primary role we undertake. And obviously, there are specific projects that we undertake. So, for instance, we have a big project in North America going on at the moment around the 2026 Football Men's World Cup, which is focusing specifically on children's rights in the host cities. We sort of organize the Human Rights Volunteer Program at the Qatar World Cup, which is a very unique sort of model of monitoring and addressing human rights issues during event time, and hopefully that will be replicated at events happening in the future as well. We organize workshops for capacity building with specific events. So we had something with the Birmingham Commonwealth Games, with the African Games in Kinshasa earlier. We organize educational products, sort of online courses and master classes in person. As Daniela earlier mentioned, we are organizing the research network on sports and human rights. There's also sort of project going on with the BBC to sort of build stories around that. So again, everything sort of ties in with the idea of generating awareness, building capacity, and creating lasting values. And there's several new projects as well. So Daniela can speak a bit about them.
Yeah, I think, maybe also back to, in addition to this generating awareness more generally, we also have very specific projects where we really work with sports bodies and trying to build their capacity. One big project last year was working with the German National Olympic Committee, one of the first national Olympic committees to actually start or embark on this journey of developing a human rights policy. That was one very concrete example. And we have other sports bodies interested in doing similar things. So we are trying to help sports bodies really change their rules or have the right rules in place, understand their human rights responsibilities. But yeah, as Shubham said, we're exciting new projects. We're doing things on safeguarding, on also sustainability, decolonization. So we try to kind of shape debates in those fields as well through publications, through organizing, consultation processes. We're doing research now with Think Sport in Switzerland on mapping good practices of how actually stakeholders can be engaged in a safe and effective way when it comes to taking decisions, shaping policies, etc. in the world of sports and human rights. So different kinds of things, but all, of course, aligned under our strategy and our mission to make the world of sports a better place. Yeah.
There's just so much going on, and anyone that has not been to your website just has to have a look and get engaged. There's just so much. There's a lot going on, and it's hard sometimes to know whether it's all having a tangible effect. And obviously the educational side is having an effect on the reshaping the way that the next generation of managers and policymakers who are in educational programs, for example, might kind of lead in the future in a more socially responsible way. Do you keep your eyes on the prize in terms of the specific metrics that illustrate when positive change is happening across these areas, or is that something that you're still kind of to develop? How would you respond to that?
We do have our theory of change, and we very much keep our eyes on the changes that are happening, and we do see changes. I think especially last year was a very crucial moment, and we had several moments where we really looked at each other and said, wow, a couple of years ago, would we have thought this would have happened? No, never. So that is really the good news. The good news is things are moving in the right direction. We do see changes, policy changes, regulatory changes being made, people understanding better what this is all about, what the center is all about, trusting us more. Also those that, are the crucial stakeholders in a certain way, the ones that make decisions and shape policy. So yes, in that sense, looking at our theory of change, we do see change happening. But I do think because it is happening now, I think there's also soon a moment to reconsider that theory and shift it slowly to looking at to what extent these changes that we see now, the new policies, the new requirements, the new regulations, to what extent they are effective, and how you can actually enforce them. I think that is really the next crucial and key step. So it's nice that we now have FIFA having a human rights policy, the IOC having a human rights framework, all of them saying, oh, our events need to be organized with human rights in mind, and we need to, respect rights of workers and all of that when we host these events. But what if something is actually still going wrong? And it does. These things happen, right? So what if human rights are still being harmed? Can these instruments, these laws, these requirements, how can they be enforced by the ones affected, right? And that goes back to what Shubham said earlier. I think our eyes should not just be on our own theory of change, the eyes on the prize, but actually in like the ultimate goal is, of course, to focus on those affected and to make their lives better. And if we look at that, or if we look from that perspective, then I think our new theory of change needs to shift slightly towards looking at how we enforce the new laws, regulations, requirements that have been introduced, which is an amazing step. But of course, it doesn't end here. Yeah.
Completely. It's a good place to finish, actually. Just one final question, though. That it's a burning question that I always have. I always hear a lot of people talk about it. I always hear students talk about it as well. Events are mega events, particularly, are really are double-edged swords, aren't they? They really can exacerbate the problem, and there's just umpteen examples of that. But they also shed light, don't they, on not only the event-induced problems, but also the everyday problems that exist in destinations that host these things and cultures and contexts anyway. And it's just quite interesting to see that debate happen. The question over whether we should host these things in the future is always a big question, and whether they are good for us, whether they offer net value back. Of course, that's a calculation that's impossible, but we can go with the metaphor. And what's your perspective on whether these things should exist in the way they are? Do you think that they need to fundamentally change, or just kind of tweaked here and there to be much more relevant and bring more of the global population on side in an era that is really questioning their value for society?
Shubham, do you want to go first? I just want to say I cannot let this question slip, because I've spent 5 years of my life writing a PhD on mega sporting events and human rights, and I looked at this obviously to know, this will be a question in my defense. But I mean, go ahead first, Shubham, and then I can
sure.
Finish.
Sure, I think that'll be appropriate. So I think the first thing to say is this is the question that we sort of tackle head on in the conclusion chapter of our book. So you'll get a much detailed, not necessarily an answer, because I don't think there's an answer to this question. Daniela might have an answer, but it's more about thoughts, I guess. But so the concluding chapter is actually a very good place to sort of go and read more in detail about this. But I think from my own personal sort of perspective, I would say that yes, the events should happen. The events should be happening wherever we can make sure that human rights are complied with, wherever we can have those events in the best possible manner such that human rights are not violated, there is remedy available, it happens in a sustainable way, etc. Having said that, I think there is also a need to sort of fundamentally think about why certain things happen. And I think the question that needs to be asked is, if we were to design these events today, and if we did not have the advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you look at it, of this whole path dependency of these events being happening for the last century, how will we design these events today? If we were to start thinking about the idea of an Olympic Games today, disregarding all the past baggage, how will we think about it today? So on and so forth. So I think that is probably a perspective to think about. rather than following the same sort of patterns of bidding, same sort of patterns of preparation, organizing, construction, etc. that we have. So maybe that is a way to rethink, reevaluate, and do things in a way that sport is more responsible, it's absolutely human rights compliant, it's sustainable, and so on and so forth. So yes, they should happen, but fundamental rethink needs to happen. And I think Daniela will have a lot more sort of detail beyond my...
And just really quickly, just show it, just to kind of touch on what you said. Is it a problem with the event? Is it with the baggage, with the path dependencies, with it? I suspect, the critic in me, and the critic doesn't come out too much. I'm very much kind of pro these things. I do think that they offer a lot of value. And I think it's a question of actually, we can't really extrapolate the value very well, methodologically, research-wise. So I'm absolutely pro, and with the sense of it needs to tweak. Can't help but think, though, that it's the fundamental institutions and the way of thinking of institutions and the focus around capital and the financial interests and that would just reproduce these things in the exact same way. And unfortunately, that might just be that I'm just a cynical bugger. But I just genuinely think that it would reproduce itself. I don't think it's good in a good sense. I don't think it's the event that's the problem. I just think it's the people and the organizations and just this kind of corruptive nature of power and money that it keeps on over the millennia, just constantly kind of reproduces itself in every single guise. And I just feel that the event is simply just a microcosm of the world, but also the context, of course, as well, that it's in. Both it's like a microcosm, transnational microcosm, but then also a contextual microcosm as well. Everything, all the creepy crawlies that are existing within a society itself. So that's my probably cynical, but I am absolutely pro. So I am still your critical friend, people. But yeah, Daniela, what about you? How would you?
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with everything that Shubham said, and I'll just try to add shortly some things, also maybe trying to react what you just said. So yeah, just to say it up front, I'm also for these events, but it's very obvious from our perspective to ask the question, why do we even do this? Why do we even have these events? But the center also puts a lot of emphasis on highlighting this unique power that sports and also mega sporting events have to actually promote human rights, to put a spotlight on human rights. And you said it briefly, Mike, yourself, it's a double-edged sword, and one side of it is, you put this on an international stage and you give a lot of attention to a certain issue, and that helps to exercise pressure to perhaps change things on the ground. Yes. But I think that is also slightly looking at the negative, the issue, the problem. You can also look at these events as a place for people to actually really find a space for promoting their rights, for standing up for what they believe is the right thing, to find like-minded people, to give certain groups in society an opportunity to come together, to raise awareness about social issues, not necessarily in a negative way always, right? So I think that's really something we shouldn't forget, and that is a power that is very unique to sports, something or a phenomenon and dynamic you don't see necessarily with other fields, sectors in our society. And that applies to sports generally, day-to-day sports, but I think applies even more to mega sporting events. The problem with these events is, and that now relates to what you said, Mike, is that they also create this culture or this climate of exceptionalism, right? So when certain actors in a country or in a city decide we need to do this, they would do anything to make it happen at a certain point, which unfortunately sometimes leads to things like normal processes, legal processes being suspended just to speed up decisions in order to relocate a community, in order to build a certain venue. And that can lead to participatory rights, other rights of citizens being, much more limited at times when these events are being hosted. And of course, that makes it much easier for corruption taking place and all sorts of other malpractices. So that is really where I think we need to find a better way of handling things. No question. Also, I think no secret that is probably easier said than done in some parts of the world than, in other parts of the world. But the goal, I think, needs to be clear for everyone, and the standard should be the same for everyone. And that's also one of our principles. The center, together with the founding members of the advisory council, they have agreed to the Sporting Chance principles. One of these principles is about every country, everyone that wants to host should have the right to host a mega sporting event. And I also believe that it's true because of all the opportunities it actually can bring with it if it's done in the right way. And that's really key, and that's what we're working towards. And also here, just as a final remark, we do see changes happening. So this whole bidding procedure, the whole life cycle of a mega sporting event, if you look to how that happened like 20 years ago or even more, there has been a lot of changes happening in the last couple of years. Also because sports body has had to, right? It's no secret that there were less and less cities and countries applying to host for obvious reasons, but also because they realized there's a lot of merit in making this much more a dialogue rather than imposing very strict requirements, but working together with those that are interested in hosting to develop, what can be the best outcome with the most positive legacy and also a positive human rights legacy. That's something that we are pushing for and that we luckily see more and more being included in these discussions.
That's great. Thanks, Daniela. That was, both of you so articulate, so interesting. We could talk for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours on this, and hopefully we'll get you back on Inside Events in the next few months to talk about maybe some specific human rights, particular issues that maybe we can go in deep delve. So thank you so much for coming on Inside Events, and all of the materials, resources, links, etc., that relate to everything that we talked about today will pop underneath the podcast wherever possible. So thank you both for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.